Hello, everyone. I'm going to be discussing the development of Debussy's Impressionist style, looking at more specifically how his music fits into the music history grand scheme between the Romantic period and what would follow. I'm going to be looking at specifically how his music was a reaction to the Romantic era and the music that was being written of that time, but was actually more of an extension of that Romantic style, as well as a departure that would ultimately influence what would come later. So we're going to be looking at him as a person and the world he was living in, as well as how his music really fits into the Romantic style that came before, and then also what he did to set his music apart and what we would ultimately later define as that Impressionist style. And then finally looking at how his music would later influence what came later. So we have to think about the world that Debussy was born into, and so he was born in the 1860s. This was the late Romantic period with Wagner and Tchaikovsky and Liszt, these larger than life musical personalities and creating larger than life music. And so this was what he was listening to and experiencing. But Debussy was very much a march to the beat of his own drum type of guy, very much independent and very emotionally driven. And so, even from his time in the conservatory, starting at age 8 as a pianist and at 18 as a composer, he very much used music as his own personal escape and simply did things his way. And that was the way he would ultimately create Impressionism. Was he took what he knew and did it his own way. And so when it came to people listening to his music and ultimately ended up with this Impressionism label, he didn't really appreciate it because that meant that people were not listening to his music and thinking about it deeply enough, or at least not in his mind. They weren't. They were simply listening to it, hearing these different qualities, and placing a label rather than appreciating it as his work and not trying to fit it in some category. Again, very much an independent and very emotionally driven. And part of that is very much a romantic sized or romantic period quality. And so a lot of people think of Debussy's music as emotionally subdued. Well, if we compare it to the music of Wagner and Tchaikovsky and Liszt and all those people we talked about, of course it is. They were very much, again, larger than life, and his music was very much not, very much calm and this atmosphere of relaxation and serenity, but taken as its own entity, we hear that his music is just as expressive as, if not more so, than those larger than life personalities. Debussy was also using the same musical techniques and materials that those contemporaries of his were using. So, still using chromaticism, non functional chords, unresolved cadences, chromatic chords, still using those as we break down tonality in the Romantic era. Also, as we listen to his music, we can very much hear an emphasis on melody and being able to pick out the melody and very emotionally driven melodies, as he was an emotionally driven person, and all within the context of these same forms that were used in the Romantic era, these open-ended forms like the nocturne and the tone poem that were these emotional vehicles for composers during this time. That and Debussy would ultimately use the same ones. Again, he was very much under the impression that he was writing in the Romantic style. He was simply doing it his own way, and that's how we ended up with Impressionism. It has to be understood that there was no Impressionism before Debussy, um, and Impressionism would begin with him and would end very shortly after his death. There were only a few other composers doing similar things at that time. And so it was his work specifically that would ultimately define what Impressionism would be and was. And really, most of the techniques that would define Impressionism came from this singular event that happened in his life. He went to the 1889 Paris exhibition and watched a gamelan ensemble. We see a picture over here on the right of a gamelan ensemble, and we know we may have seen something like this. This comes from Indonesia, East Asia, and it's an ensemble made up of performers on pitched gongs and a few drums, and very much an East Asian flavor, if you will. And so Debussy was very much so influenced by this gamelan ensemble that he tried to mimic these sounds um, within the context of the Western music that he was writing. And so from this, we get whole tone scales, that dreamlike progression of notes that we know to be very much an impressionist sound. Also, he'll use very much more pentatonic type melodies and harmonies in his music from then on. And then also we get the technique that we know as a very much impressionist technique of planing and or parallel chord movement. If we really think about it, we can see a direct influence from the gamelan ensemble. We can imagine the gamelan performers moving up and down both hands, or moving up and down in parallel motion on their gongs, and then Debussy ultimately wanting to mimic that on the piano and in other works, that parallel motion. Um, we can see in his Reverie these same influences. So in the bass line alone, we have very much a do, re, mi, la pentatonic outline there for that. And then the melody will not stray too far from that. And so we have these, again, this East meets West sort of flair to this romantic style that Debussy was born into. And when it came to the rest of the world taking this in, it was either they loved it or they hated it. There really was no in between. So on the side of loving it, we had the creation of Les Six, who were similar to the Russian Five, this group of composers that took Debussy's music and ran with it and tried to promote create this musical identity for France in the early 1900s. But on the flip side, we have allegations that part of the sparking of the neoclassic movement that would follow the Impressionist movement was a reaction against specifically Debussy's music. They may have felt he took Romanticism too far, and so we need to kind of take a step back and reclaim the classical style instead. And furthermore, not only on a musical front, but Debussy would have national effects. And during World War II, Germany would use Wagner's music to promote the Nazi regime during World War II. And so France, in response to that, would do the same thing with Debussy's music. So Debussy ultimately became the sound of France later. Again, the techniques that Debussy would develop would influence all the music that would come later. So we can even see that in this jazz musical selection from Cole Porter's All of You. In the last two measures here, we see this planing effect that, again, we can imagine Debussy wanting to mimic that gamelan ensemble, but it has now found its way into Cole Porter jazz-influenced musical Silk Stockings, even in 1954. So, once again, Debussy's music is not so far detached from Romanticism as we may first think. Its Impressionism is not so far detached from what came before. It's more of an enhancement on Romanticism that would ultimately shape everything that was to follow. I thank you for your time, and please feel free to ask any questions.